So the theme of today's conference is end-of-life issues and the topic of assisted suicide, which is something very timely for those of us in California because of the recent legalization of assisted suicide and because of the many issues that surround end-of-life care in the United States and in California. So the layout of the talks for this evening, I will be speaking about assisted suicide, and then Julie Grimstad will be talking about end-of-life decision-making questions, and Jennifer Heyman will also be discussing that in conjunction with her own personal story about being in a coma and her husband's fight to save her life, which was ultimately very successful, and her consciousness during her coma and the importance of protecting even people whom we are considering brain dead. So to begin, I'm going to talk a little bit about the topic of assisted suicide. And for my research, much of this is from our most recent Supreme Court Justice's book. Chief Justice Gorsuch literally wrote the book on physician-assisted suicide in the United States. He published this book called The Future of Assisted Suicide and Euthanasia about 10 years ago, back in 2006, and I would recommend all of you to read it. It's a really wonderful book. Before I launch into the talk, though, just remember this. You have on your table these little sort of recipe cards here. If you have any questions during any of the talks, feel free to write down your question on here. We'll have some of our wonderful staff here from Right to Life of Central California go around the room and collect the cards with any questions you have, and we'll present them to our speakers at the end of their talk. And that way we won't have to pass the microphone around, and it'll be just a bit more convenient. So, okay. So for my talk today, I'm going to discuss assisted suicide more broadly and in the context of California. So what we need to do first is define some terms. There are two bad practices at the end of life that we have to deal with. One of them is assisted suicide, and the other is euthanasia. And these terms are sometimes used interchangeably, but they're a little different, so let me explain what they mean. Assisted suicide is essentially when a doctor helps you to commit suicide. He gives you the means, but you actually carry it out. So in the context of California, for example, how this functions is a doctor will prescribe you with medication, and that medication, which I'm putting air quotes around, is actually a kind of poison. It's a deadly substance that you take it and you die. So the doctor prescribes it to you, but you yourself take it. So you are the agent there. It is genuinely an act of suicide. Euthanasia is different. Euthanasia is the act of the doctor himself administering whatever poisonous drug, medication. So it is the act of the doctor killing you. Now, we can see how these two practices would be similar, but they are a little different. Euthanasia can sometimes be voluntary, and in many cases in history, including our modern history today in places in certain parts of Europe, euthanasia could be involuntary or questionably voluntary. So a person who may have at one point said, I don't want to live under certain conditions. If I do, please kill me. But then when they get to that point, say, hey, please don't kill me. There's some difficult moral quandaries that present themselves there. So euthanasia is a doctor killing you. Assisted suicide is you killing yourself with the assistance, usually, of a doctor. Okay. So first, we got to understand why this stuff is bad. Now, this is a pro-life audience, so I think your natural instincts are all going to be right on, and you don't need me necessarily to tell you that these things are wrong, but I'm hopeful my explanations of why these things are wrong will maybe be something a little different from what you've heard before and allow you to think about these things with greater clarity. So the first point is the essential specialness of humanity. All right? Humanity is qualitatively different, not quantitatively different, like by virtue of degrees, but qualitatively different, basically in a different category from any other animal. And it's because of these very uniquely human features that we have. The ability to engage in abstract reasoning, to engage in moral decision-making, to have profound and deep thoughts. We have these intellective capacities that no other animal has. You can teach Coco the gorilla basic sign language, but Coco the gorilla can't found the university or write the scientific study about how she taught an ape how to perform sign language. Okay, there's a complete qualitative difference there between any human and between humans and gorillas. All right, and we would say that these uniquely human capacities are characteristic of our species as a whole and give great dignity and value to our entire species, not just to persons who can exercise those capacities. Okay, now that's sounded a little mumbo jumbo, but let me reel you back in. A baby who's a week old is not less human or less valuable than I am simply because they don't know their multiplication tables, they can't have abstract thoughts about things like truth or justice or whatever. A baby is still valuable, is still a person, because they belong to this human family. Okay? And we believe that, therefore, so what we believe is that these uniquely human traits adhere to humanity as a whole. And just because you aren't developed enough to exercise those faculties, or just because of a mental disability like Down syndrome, or physical handicap like you've been in an accident, or at the end of life you have something like Alzheimer's or you're brain dead, this doesn't remove you from the circle of humanity. You're still a person. You're still valuable. This is at the root of our pro-life commitment. This is why we believe fetuses who are fully human beings also have value. Okay. So essentially we believe human life is a basic good. And the taking of human life is something very seriously wrong. The taking of innocent human life, the intentional taking of innocent human life, is something wrong and categorically wrong. Judge Gorsuch, in his book on assisted suicide and euthanasia, talks about human life in these terms, that it has an inherent value, not what some would call an instrumental value. Okay? So Judge Gorsuch is looking at the writings of various modern legal scholars and philosophers, people whose names you probably don't know, but who are extremely important in legal academia, and they're very important in the minds of judges and the people who write and interpret our laws. People like Ronald Dworkin, people like the Princeton ethicist Peter Singer, who believes in infanticide and all kinds of awful things. People like Judge Richard Posner on the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals. These people essentially believe that humanity has value only when they exercise those uniquely human functions, okay? And thus, as it relates to the question of assisted suicide and euthanasia, these people are extremely permissive. They think euthanasia is uncontroversial when someone doesn't have, because of the state they're in, they're at the end of life state they're in, they aren't able to exercise some of those human functions. They're not able, as Peter Singer would say, to engage in creative activity or words to that effect. And our new Supreme Court Justice, in his book, castigates these viewpoints, because essentially what he says is, you're effectively picking and choosing certain human characteristics almost arbitrarily as being what gives someone value. And this arbitrariness, where you're including some human beings and not including other human beings in the community of persons who have value, there are some really high stakes involved in that process, which could lead to some human beings being murdered and being killed. It's not like picking and choosing what speed limit to put on a stretch of road. You're picking and choosing which human beings have value and which ones don't. So, if anything, if you're going to derive anything from my talk, at least you can derive some comfort that we have a really good new Supreme Court justice. But the essential bedrock proposition is that humans have value regardless of their ability to exercise those uniquely human functions. Okay. Beyond that, assisted suicide and euthanasia are wrong for what I would call consequential reasons, not only because in and of itself it's bad, but because of the consequences of what follows, okay? And now let me illustrate this by talking about our governor, Jerry Brown. When Jerry Brown signed physician-assisted suicide into law back in late 2015, he issued a statement. And in that statement, he was talking about, when I look at the end of my life and I'm thinking about what options I want to have available to me, I want to have open to myself the possibility that if I'm in terminal condition and if I'm really suffering, I want to have the option to end my life. This is incredibly short-sighted on the part of Jerry Brown because a lot of the problems with assisted suicide are not problems that Jerry Brown is ever going to have to face. Jerry Brown, who's a very successful man, a man who's made a lot of money in his life, and is going to have access to some of the best healthcare options at the end of his life that money can buy. One of the great public policy problems with assisted suicide is the predicament in which it puts lower-income persons, particularly in minority communities in this state. So let me give you an example. You're a lower-income guy living in East LA. You don't have a lot of money. You don't have great healthcare access. You receive a terminal diagnosis. You see that the chemotherapy treatments that are being required of you to keep on going, they're going to cost your family a ton of money. Like most people, 90% of the medical resources in terms of cost that you're going to consume are going to be consumed in your last year of life. And you think to yourself, well, I'm living in California, so I have two options here. I can either fight this cancer and try to survive and put financial strain on my family, or I can seek out two physicians who will undoubtedly say that I'm qualified to make this decision. They will prescribe me with medication for physician-assisted suicide, and I can kill myself very cheaply. It puts such a perverse moral pressure on lower-income persons to make choices that they simply should not make. And our law simply does not have the safeguards in place to prevent someone from taking their life wrongly. So let's look at how the California law is supposed to function, okay? The way it's supposed to function is this. Someone goes to a doctor, and that doctor confirms that you have 6 months or less to live. They judge that you are mentally competent, and then they prescribe you, and only then, only after two doctors have seen you and judged you mentally competent, two doctors agree to this, they prescribe you with the medication for physician-assisted suicide. They give you, essentially, some pills, and you take those pills home, and at your leisure, at your discretion, you administer those pills to yourself. You kill yourself, okay? Now let's look at the problems there. You need two physicians to sign off on this assisted suicide procedure. But the California law doesn't keep track of, just like the Oregon law, the California law does not keep track of how many doctors you went to before those two doctors who told you, no, I don't think you should do this. No, I don't think your terminal diagnosis is 6 months. No, I don't think that you are necessarily mentally competent to make this decision. No, I think you might be suffering from depression. Okay? So all you need is those two doctors, but that's not really a great safeguard. It doesn't take into account any doctors you went to before who said no. Secondly, if you really want to kill yourself, the state of California is providing you with information, phone numbers, things like that, about places to call to get information on this. And the people you'll call are the same people who helped to push this law through our state legislature back in 2015. These are people who are committed to these notions that the right to a physician-assisted suicide is really part of your rights, human rights, okay? They are connected with a network of pro-physician-assisted suicide doctors who they know will deem you to be mentally competent and who will prescribe you with those drugs, okay? So the same people you're getting in touch with to learn more about physician-assisted suicide are the very people committed to keeping it legal and committed to providing you with resources to help kill yourself. So again, the alleged protections that this bill includes to keep people from wrongfully ending their lives are not real protections at all. Essentially, if you want to end your life, you may. There's no real protection against doctors who may deem you mentally unfit. Beyond this, there are all kinds of other disastrous dangers. Note that you don't have to take your physician-assisted suicide medication at a clinic in the presence of a doctor. You're taking it home with you. You may or may not use it. And it's sitting, you've got deadly medication sitting in your cabinet where maybe your kid takes it. There are no safeguards around the administration of this medication, okay? And finally, there's this sort of fallacy around the idea of a 6-month terminal diagnosis. Now, non-medical people hear, 6-month terminal diagnosis, and I think they assume that there is greater certainty among physicians than there actually is. When this bill was being debated in the California legislature, what you saw from the side of the opponents was a never-ending stream of examples of people who had received 6-month terminal diagnoses, 3-month terminal diagnoses, 1-month terminal diagnoses, and who had gone on to live for the next 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, who had lived to see their grandchildren, who had lived to see their great-grandchildren, et cetera, who had been able to live out another 5, 10, 20 fruitful years of life. There also aren't real safeguards against the many kinds of depression that people who receive a terminal diagnosis naturally go through. And what is often found is that the people who try to get physician-assisted suicide and who wind up not going through with it are almost universally glad they did not. And basically what we're doing is we're unhealthily giving leeway to something that is probably the result of some kind of naturally occurring mental depression that naturally comes with a terminal diagnosis. And the kind response, the charitable response, the loving response is not, yes, let me push you further over the cliff. No, the kind and loving response is to reach out to this person with love and care and concern. Okay. So how does this relate to everything else we're going to talk about? Essentially, the fundamental point of all of what we're going to discuss today is that human life has profound dignity and value, and that it needs to be safeguarded. To actively take human life at the end of life, at the beginning of life, is a grave affront to human dignity. And we also have to, there are also certain medical ethical principles that should guide us in thinking about these things. One of them is the profound difference between the active taking of life and the passive allowing of nature to take its course, okay? This is a really significant principle of medical ethics that have guided doctors really since the times of the Hippocratic Oath throughout the entire history of Western civilization. Essentially what we're saying is this: to refuse to accept extraordinary healthcare treatments, at a point in life where it's clear that the end is coming and that nature should take its course, is something profoundly different from someone actively killing you, from someone actively administering you poison, from you yourself actively administering poison to yourself, okay? There's a profound difference in terms of the action that's being taken place as far as the intention of the person doing so. And this is a critically important question of medical ethics that's going to apply not just to the question of physician-assisted suicide and its rightness and wrongness, but it's also going to apply to the kinds of end-of-life decision-making the end-of-life decisions we need to make when we're faced with a terminal diagnosis.